Francisco, Scott, David, and I would like to welcome you to the 10th Pediatric Upper Limb and Microsurgery Pulm Talks. Chaired by David McComb, this session will feature Max Horwitz, Jim Higgins, and me as moderators, featuring Lam, who will be speaking on the OMT classification.
Edinburgh, who has been very involved in the update of the OMT classification and is going to give us his interpretation of that.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I hope this talk will be of interest to most of you. I'm just going to play it.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizers for asking me to speak on the OMT. I was part of a group that was looking at updating this classification last year. So this is the scope of my talk. I will give an introduction to the OMT because not everyone is familiar with it. Talk about some of the major changes to the 2015 version, and lastly, share my thoughts on what are the ongoing challenges and some of my recommendations. It is difficult to understand the OMT without having a background of embryology. The upper limb forms between 4 to 8 weeks, when the embryo is just the size of a small seed, and then the limb differentiates, forms, and then grows to size at birth. Growth of the upper limb occurs in 3 directions as controlled by 3 signaling centers, each with its own responsible protein pathway. I always find it hard to visualize these 3 axes, especially the dorsal ventral pathway. So maybe this animation would help. The AER, the ZPA, and then the dorsal ectoderm controlling the dorsal ventral pathway. It's important to note that these 3 axes works in close synchronization to form the upper limb. Most of our knowledge about these axes comes from animal experiments using the silky chicken, and manipulation of these signaling centers or their pathways produce limb defects, extrapolated to the kind of defects that we see in humans. And this really is the basis of the OMT. Now, the Swanson's classification, which many of you will be familiar with, tried very hard to follow the path of embryology. So errors in the pathway very early on led to the conditions caused by a failure of formation, differentiation, duplication, and perhaps undergrowth. Undergrowth is very vague. Subsequent errors led to conditions of overgrowth, constriction bands, or miscellaneous. There were growing dissatisfaction, however, with the Swansons. The classic example is symbrachydactyly. Is this failure of formation, differentiation, or undergrowth? And what about thumb hyperplasia, or even cleft 10? Is cleft a failure of formation only? So this was where the OMT started to come in. Mansky and Olberg, OMM, published this article in 2009, where they tried to produce some form of standardization using the Swansons, which up to then had been the official IFASH classification for 50 years. So this was obviously not enough, and a year later, they produced a new classification with Tonkin, which became known as the OMT system, and the developmental biology basis for this classification was given. There were 3 groups initially: malformation, based on the 3 axes as we saw earlier, deformation, where the insult occurs after normal formation, and dysplasia. So if you look at the limb development charts again, malformation is the result of errors in the earlier stages, deformation and dysplasia perhaps in the latter stages, and syndromes right at the beginning. Now, sadly, Paul Mansky passed away in 2011, and in 2013, the group published an update with the addition of an unspecified axis in malformation for conditions that we don't really know what their predominant axis is, and syndromes as a separate group. And in 2014, the IFASH Scientific Committee for Congenital Hands finally recommended replacement of the Swanson with the OMT classification, with a recommended 3-yearly update with contributions from the scientific community. In 2015, Tonkin and Olberg again updated the classification. This version is the same as the 2017 publication. There were several changes, especially in the dysplasias and deformation group. For example, arthrogryposis has been moved 3 times. So this is the 2015-2017 OMT classification, which means that in 2020 was due an update. And this is what we did. So this report is published on the IFESH website, and there are 2 papers describing it in detail in the Journal of Hand Surgery American and also in the European Journal. And the European one is also in the current IFESH EZIN. So please take a look. Now I want to take some time to talk about the OMT app. So this is something that we developed, which can be found easily on the IFESH website. So you go to the website, it's under resources, and it's available for free download. So the OMT app follows the latest version of the OMT classification. So it is quick and easy to search for a condition, including all the list of the syndromes. So when you click on the condition, you get an image. Here's an example of symbrachydactyly, the description, and then the known etiology. When you, there are keyword search function as well. I find this very helpful. So when you search for thumb, you get different thumb anomalies, plus the various syndromes with thumb conditions. And then radial deficiency, for example, you get the list of syndromes with radial aplasia, which can be very useful, especially when you're not sure about what a syndrome is. So click on Nager syndrome, for example, you get the image, the hallmark features, the genetic etiology, the upper limb features, and then you get an OMIM link, which takes you straight to the website, which I find that very, very useful for more information. So that's the OMT classification in a nutshell, a system that really reflects the close collaboration between surgeons and developmental biologists. So let me now share some of the changes that have recently been implemented in the 2020 version. So there are several. Let me summarize the key ones. You will notice that the new classification is a lot simpler with single conditions rather than combined ones. A few terms have been added to improve understanding, early and late patterning, for example, and also the level of proximal distal defects have been compressed from humeral to fingers rather than spreading them out. And the division of transverse arrest and symbrachydactyly are further clarified with the addition of ectodermal elements or not. In deformations, trigger digits have been definitively removed, so as it is no longer considered a congenital condition. Several conditions have been moved in light of recent discoveries about their etiology. It is now undisputed that the cleft hand is a defect in the AER, so it was moved from the unspecified axis to the proximal distal axis. Another example is arthrogryposis. This has now been moved to a new category in dysplasias, together with distal arthrogryposis, camptodactyly, and thumb in palm deformity. And finally, a major addition is the OMIM link, as mentioned in the app, and this links to the syndromes and their subtypes. So these are the major updates, major changes. Please download the app. Now, despite the update, the system is not perfect, as was noted in the original report from the IFESH. You see, one of the most important reasons why we need an IFESH or universal classification is so that we can all sing from the same hymn sheet for input into databases. That means we all speak the same language and we describe something so we can compare our outcomes. But the problem is not everyone will classify the same condition in the same way. I found this when choosing pictures for the app. And also different conditions, I think we need re-examining as to what they really mean, which means new categories may need to be formed or conditions shifted around. So for example, none of us will have any problems diagnosing this as syndactyly. But what is this? You can easily see different people diagnosing this differently as cranodactyly, or is this ulnar dysplasia? What about this? Would you classify this as ulnar dysplasia? Would you classify this as cleft hand? Now, what about this? This is courtesy of Max, who's the moderator. Would you call this clinodactyly, or would you call this some form of statal dysplasia? How would you put this in the OMT? You can easily see different people putting this under different category. This is a patient of mine. Would you call this complex syndactyly? He's non-syndromic. Would you put this under non-otherwise specified or complex syndactyly? What about this? Is this a ulnar dysplasia, or is it one of the very rare ulnar side cleft hand described by Tonkin? Or these cases that we recently published, congenital nerve palsy with no apparent cause, how does it fit in here in the OMT? And there is currently a group of us from 3 continents looking at this, led by Lindley, Dave, and myself, and hopefully we'll be able to shed more light on how we can have a more uniform classification. In the critical examination of the OMT, I also found myself questioning the definition of certain conditions. For example, the term phocomelia. What exactly is phocomelia? Usually described as an intercalary defect with missing segments and a hand present. Friends and O'Reilly classified into 3 types: complete, proximal, or distal, and this is in the OMT. But many, including Swanson's, had questioned the existence of true intercalary defects. This was the point of the paper from Tyler, Lee, Strong, and Hooper. Some phocomelia are just not classifiable. And whatever the level is, the hand is never normal. This example of my own patient where I thought initially was distal phocomelia, but probably was an ulnar deficiency. These were pictures of another patient I put on the ad as distal phocomelia initially, but I removed after the comments from my colleagues that it is probably ulnar dysplasia. I'm sure I'm not the only one who is confused. I think it is a spectrum, and I found Goldfarb's classification very useful in describing the different conditions. So he described it as proximal radial deficiency, proximal ulnar deficiency, or a severe combined dysplasia, which can be divided into type A and type B. And so maybe phocomelia could be just simply a longitudinal dysplasia, and maybe we need to modify the OMT. So let's look at this child. Some may classify this as a distal phocomelia, but is this in fact a proximal ulnar deficiency? You can actually see the bifid humerus here, which gives a clue. What about this? How would you classify this on the OMT? On the right, I think it's an amelia transverse arrest. On the left, is this phocomelia or some form of a severe deficiency type B? Now, you may wonder why some of my pictures are black and white, and that's because I recently acquired a treasure of notes from the late Douglas Lam, whom some of you may know treated several children from the era of the thalidomide tragedy. So we're currently going through these old notes and reclassifying these conditions, many of which was classified as congenital absence. This has been quite an exercise. Now, in his time, the term phocomelia was very broadly used, very loosely used, and it was also described as a common characteristic deformity of thalidomide. And it's interesting to note, not much has changed the past 40 years about nomenclature. So some of the cases from the archive described as phocomelia in the notes can probably be classified as bilateral amelia transverse arrest in the OMT. These were the thalidomide cases. What about this on the right side? Described simply as phocomelia. Should this be perhaps a severe combined dysplasia or proximal radial ulnar deficiency? What about this? Is this phocomelia, or is it a severe combined dysplasia or proximal radial ulnar deficiency? Or this, is this again a phocomelia or severe combined dysplasia? So what ultimately is phocomelia, and is it time to change this term? Or perhaps in the OMT we can add a new category and divide the radial ulnar axis into proximal and distal defects to make it more inclusive. I think you get the point. The OMT allows you to do that. Another area I find very challenging, let me end with this, is to define the difference between transverse arrest and symbrachydactyly. We have added ectodermal elements with and without in the new OMT, but some may differ in what they count as ectodermal elements. So this is an easy case. Most will call this a symbrachydactyly, and this as a transverse arrest, but sometimes it is not straightforward. What would classify as an ectodermal element? These are more examples. So in conclusion, the OMT has the potential to finally unite different specialties and surgeons in speaking one universal language, but the challenges remain. I still think is the best that we have got. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wee. That's fantastic. Max is going to moderate the session, and have we got you on board? Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wee. That was a great talk. it's definitely the hardest one to give on a Sunday afternoon when we've spoken about real nuts and bolt cases with screws and bits of bone. Just a quick show of hands. Well, if anyone can turn on their camera, it would be amazing. Who regularly uses the OMT? This is my usual question I ask when people, if you could turn on your cameras, that would be great. I know it's Sunday. So it is really good. And I think something we have to accept is that it's changing. And every 3 or 4 years, we are going to have to take the new version. What I find helps in the clinic is to definitely use Wheeze app, and it definitely change things. And then also print out and laminate a copy of the up-to-date paper from last year. I think that's pretty useful. So, I mean, I've still got some problems with the registry, and I know that, Carly, you use the CUD registry, don't you? So, and Dave, I mean, we discussed this briefly via email. My problem is what you do when there's a difference. So I think part of the CUD is you meet up and discuss. Do you discuss every case, or is it only ones where there's a question? It's the ones with a question. And Dave, what do you do if there's doubt, putting it on the registry?
Well, we're not as far advanced as the CUD registry in terms of that unclassifiable or difficult to define. I think that's going to be something we have to go back and clean the data. I think one thing that is interesting is that there's things evolve, particularly with skeletal changes. You can, things that aren't necessarily apparent early become a little bit more apparent as things progress. And
yeah, that is very true. I mean, just this Friday, cut it down to something very simple, because the reality is we see a lot more simple than complicated. I had a duplicate thumb, which when I initially saw them looked like a non-Vassell type thumb. And because we've had long delays in getting cases to theatre in the United Kingdom, it's a total scandal. They called me up 4 days before and said, you can have an operating list. So I didn't have up-to-date x-rays. So I took it to theatre thinking it was a non-Vassell, and on the table I did some screening. And absolutely, I hadn't seen the kid for 7 months and got a surprise that things weren't where they were, which counts for the most basic ones. What do we think about the OMT not including feet, and not including simple things like trigger fingers, trigger thumbs? What do we think about when we don't agree?
Have you got a comment about that?
I was wondering who's directing that question to.
You can start off,
I think ultimately, I think ultimately you still need a group of people to define what should or should not be included. Though it is a universal classification, I mean, who knows? In 50 years, maybe the OMT will be replaced by something else, like the way you replace the Swansons. I don't think it's a perfect classification. I think there's always going to be changes. I think there's always going to be disputes whether trigger thumb or fingers is a congenital condition. But ultimately, you get it out there, you publish, and then you dispute, and maybe in 3 to 5 years' time, you change again.
Okay. And what do you say to the detractors? I mean, there's some colleagues of ours from Holland, there's some from the UK who just absolutely refuse to use it, and they say it's too difficult. I mean, what should our, as a group, we're a group of pediatric hand surgeons who have an interest, but what should we be telling to the occasional pediatric surgeon or the actual pediatric surgeon who refuses? And there are a lot of people out there, despite the fact that it's part of the IFSSH.
It's I think the OMT is an acquired taste. I think it's not something that you look at it, with 50 to 100 conditions and you go, that's a great classification, I'm going to use it. And that's why I developed the app, because I know otherwise I think it's just impossible to use it. But I mean, it's been one of those things where the more I use it, the more I appreciate maybe the genius thought behind it, the challenges and the flexibility, and I think the thing I appreciate most about the OMT is, I mean, we regularly get a condition that we've never seen before. We got one recently on the 5-source chat group, and the question hasn't always been immediately, what are you going to do about this? The question has been, what is the diagnosis, or how do you classify this? And I begin to see that more and more. And we are not satisfied to just jump straight into the management of a condition. We want to know what the diagnosis is. And this is probably where things are going. And then in the future, we're going to start asking, what is the etiology of this? Because we no longer want to be a subspecialty of pediatric hand surgeons who just fix things. We want to know why things happen, what is the etiology, what is the, the genetic molecular basis of it. And I think the OMT provides a very good framework for that. But I'm very happy to hear what everybody else thinks.
I agree. I think the challenges are for, the use of it is, if your focus is on databases and then every once in a while you have to go back and revisit everything that's already in the database and reclassify it, that's obviously labor intensive. But I guess the more accurate it is, I think that when we talk to our genetics colleagues and our embryology, the embryologists amongst our pediatric colleagues, they're sort of coming from a different perspective. And the OMT, at least there's a bit of common ground for us with them, I think.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, I agree with you, both of you, on etiology. And yeah, I think maybe in 30, 40, probably 50 years times, we're going to be looked at as not being able to treat things embryologically. But do you think the OMT has significantly advanced management of the cases, or mismanagement not happening?
I guess my thought would be is if it means that we can be more accurate in what we're talking about when we're collating cases to evaluate them, then that, as we were saying in his talk, it's speaking the same language of what we actually think we're talking about. So, on a current,
so the correlation of the OMT is that we need big data. I mean, it's only now that they're starting to agree on simple things like osteoarthritis of thumbs and carpal tunnel management. So if we had big data using OMT, so are we as a group saying that probably one of our missions should really be getting everybody to use it and everybody to send it to a central place with outcomes?
Yeah, I don't know. Dan, have you got a comment about?
So, yeah, I think we is right. It is an acquired taste, a taste which I have yet to acquire.
How we drew him in at last.
Yeah. No, but I think, the Swanson classification to me feels dated. It feels incomplete. It feels like it's something that is from a different era. The OMT classification is a bit cumbersome. I think Max is right. I think We's app makes it certainly much easier. I can't say that, it's rare that I come across a deformity in the clinic that I don't know what it is, but it happens. I mean, and those outliers are the interesting, are sort of the, that's the meat of it, right? And I don't know how. I mean, I think if we put a whole bunch of people together and we try to get a consensus, we can certainly do that through FISOs to some degree, but we can do that internationally if we have a repository of crazy deformities, what Pete Carter used to call carpals I have seen, right? If you remember that, Carly. I don't know if he gave that, but yeah, that may be helpful. But I don't know if we're going to come to a consensus on these things, and I'm not so sure that all these outliers are really all that important. I think maybe some things are unclassifiable, and that's the way they need to fit. And sometimes you have two maybe they're so rare because you have 2 embryologic hits, and that's why we have such difficulty classifying them. So I think, the OMT classification, any classification is really designed for 1 hit. And maybe it's the double hit that's the problem, and that's why we struggle.
So I don't think the OMT will have a direct impact on surgical management. But not many classification systems do have a direct impact. The Wassow classification, maybe, but I don't think it has a definite direct impact on surgical management. I don't think the OMT is designed to be like that. I think one of the potential benefits of the OMT is that the more one uses it, the more one thinks about the developmental biological basis, the genetic basis, and maybe in 50 years' time, the management of these conditions would be dependent on what the embryological basis is. Maybe things would change. Now, I really hope in 50 years' time, we will not have a classification system that is based on the genetic cause. So syndactyly, you have 50 classifications for syndactyly, each of these with a single mutational change. I think we'll really go crazy if that happens. I'm hoping that wouldn't happen. I think I think that the OMT, as Dave said, is a very good balance between what the surgeons think and the developmental biologists think. And I think we have to keep it that way. It is a precarious balance.
Yeah, I think, but I think in terms of, and we're going to invite Carly back to do another talk in the future on outcome studies. But if we're talking about, it's part of what we've been talking about in this series is how to do things, and perhaps it's not necessarily how, but whether we should do things and what happens, in the longer term with these kids, and where we're sort of doing the right things necessarily all the time or not with our current approaches. And to get to that, we've all got to be talking about the same apples and oranges, so to speak. So I think there is, there's the value for it.
I think I totally agree with you. I think we do have to keep using it, but I think at the same time, as a group, we have to keep meeting. I mean, I have the problem of when you have a bilateral case and they're both slightly different, how do you OMT them?
You're supposed to OMT both of them, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Did you just turn
two
OMT
diagnoses.
into a verb?
Sorry?
Yeah, it's a verb.
It's a verb now?
Wow. You can use it in Scrabble too. It's not a pronoun.
That's progress.
But do you do 2 sets of outcomes? That's the question. Are you doing 2 sets of outcomes for right and for left? Or are you just doing one?
I think it depends on the database, isn't it?
And what's going to bias your outcome more, your right hand or your left?
Well, and then the next thing is
Carly will tell us.
The next thing is, and the goalposts are changing because our pattern of use has changed. In my professional lifetime, it's gone from, crayons to using phones. So the thumb is important where it used to be that, and now it's this. And these sort of changes are also going to influence, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things the OMT has made me do is to think very, very deeply about conditions. I mean, I give the example of phocomelia. I'll be interested to know what your thoughts are. I've never seen phocomelia in that way before until I have to think about the OMT and where do I fit things. And I realized that, there are very, very few true phocomelia. I'm not even sure true phocomelia exist or whether these are all very proximal longitudinal deficiencies. So yeah, I mean, what are your experiences with phocomelia?
My experience isn't that great, but I take your point. It's not like it's a flipper with a normal distal segment. It's always pretty dysplastic. So I think that's a matter of interpretation. Carly, Dan, Max?
Yeah, go ahead, Max.
Yeah, I don't think I have enough phocomelias to classify on the OMT. I think you're making it up as you go along. I think the key thing is for us to all meet on a regular basis and to discuss these cases. That's my minimal contribution here.
Well, then that's one good benefit of the OMT.
So look, I'd really like to thank our speakers, Carly, Wee, and Dave Stewart, for participating, and our moderators, Max, Dan, and Jim Higgins.
Make sure to catch our next session on April 11th, featuring Don Bay on lateral condyle fractures, Carolyn Leclerc on hyponeurotization and cerebral palsy, and Wendong Xu on contralateral C7 and cerebral palsy. This will be chaired by me, with Juan Jose, Gil, Wee Lam, and Scott Cozen as moderators. Thank you.